Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński and you're watching Break the Fake. They make them, we break them, and tell you everything you need to know. Let's start today's episode with Putin, who has now taken offense with Donald Trump. The reason is simple. The US has announced another package of sanctions against Russian banks, defense companies and oligarchs close to the government. Even Trump, who previously supported the idea that you can negotiate with Putin, this time supported the idea of tough pressure on Moscow instead, which isn't in any way inconsistent, by the way, as we shall see in a moment.
Теперь, что касается новых санкций. Во-первых, ничего нового здесь нет. Да, они для нас носят серьезный, конечно, характер, это понятно, и будут иметь определенные последствия, но существенно все-таки не скажутся на нашем экономическом самочувствии. Это, конечно, попытка оказать давление на Россию. Но ни одна уважающая себя страна и ни один уважающий себя народ никогда ничего не решает под давлением. И, безусловно, Россия имеет такую привилегию чувствовать себя и считать себя в этом списке уважающих себя стран и народов.
Putin solemnly declared, no self-respecting country does anything under pressure. Well, of course. But then again, why is the budget bursting at the seams, factories shutting down, and gasoline prices rising faster than in pre-war Europe? While Kremlin propaganda heroically proclaims that sanctions mean nothing to them, the real figures tell a different story. Also, the Kremlin dictator wouldn't be himself if he didn't angrily lash out at Western weapon systems for a bit, which might as well be Russia's equivalent of the old man yells at cloud meme, given how effective it is. Nobody's even remotely surprised that Putin threatened grave consequences if Ukraine ever gets the Tomahawks. But that also shows the potency of the thing, you see. Even when Trump said he wouldn't be sending them in, Putin chose to address this, because he knows the missiles are only temporarily off the table and may reappear should the need arise.
Место ее проведения были предложены американской стороной. И я согласился с этим, но выразил соображения в этой связи и сказал о том, что, безусловно, такие встречи нужно, что можно сказать, всегда диалог всегда лучше, чем какая-то конфронтация, чем какие-то споры или тем более война. Поэтому мы всегда это поддерживали, продолжение диалога, и сейчас это поддерживаем.
The whole escalation talk, if you haven't noticed it yet, seems more of a ritual than anything anyway. Russia always says any given Western boost to Ukraine will be tantamount to World War III, only to quietly swallow the bitter pill once the weapons actually do appear. It worked with tanks, it worked with fighter jets, and with the HIMARS, so Tomahawks are likely to be no different. All it takes for Trump is to stick to his guns and shout, "Cope harder!" at the Russians, instead of listening to various escalation experts at the Pentagon. Putin said that dialogue is always better than continuing the war. It sounds nice, but translated from Putinese into human language, it means, we are losing, give us a break. And while the world laughs at the latest statements from the tired old man with the nuclear briefcase, Russia continues to sink under sanctions, deficits and military failures, because in reality the only dialogue Putin understands is the language of facts and sanctions. And that is why Trump's current approach carries no contradiction. Yes, you can talk to Putin, although why would you want to? Trump evidently has superhuman patience. But in order for this to work, you need to skip the speak softly part and get straight to the big tomahawk-shaped stick. Russia tends to present its economy as being in good health, but is it really? This is a fake that won't be too difficult to break. All it takes is looking at the latest statistics. What have we here? Oh, 3 Russian state giants, Gazprom, Rosneft and Russian Railways, have officially set an anti-record. Their combined debt has exceeded approximately $152 billion. By way of comparison, this is more than the total annual spending in most Russian regions. Economists point to several factors: a sharp drop in export revenues due to sanctions and restrictions on access to external capital markets, high key rates which make debt servicing extremely expensive, huge military expenditures by the state which have made it difficult to support companies. In other words, even the biggest symbols of economic power in Russia are now like students begging for a little loan. Things are bad for me, but I promise I'll pay back someday. Yeah, if Gazprom and Rosneft are up to their ears in debt, small and medium-sized businesses are in an even worse situation. Loans are becoming unavailable. Sales markets are shrinking. The state, engrossed in war, does not have the resources to save private ventures anymore. To put it bluntly, being a small business in Russia is not a fun experience at all. And that's before you even consider the prospect of having your workforce summarily expedited to the front line, leaving you with nothing. In fact, we are seeing symptoms of a systemic economic crisis. The war continues to drain resources, and state-owned companies are only staying afloat thanks to hope and state guarantees, which are insufficient, by the way. The debts of Gazprom, Rosneft and the Russian railways are like a house of cards. The higher it is, the more dangerous it becomes. Even a slight breeze of sanctions could blow the whole structure down. Russian state giants, which for decades have been positioned as economic titans, are now neck-deep in debt. If the Kremlin does not stop the war and stabilize the economy, the debt hole will only get deeper, and small businesses and the population will end up at the very bottom. Would you invite Russia into your home? Unless you're a dictator in distress, you probably wouldn't. But that isn't stopping Russian propaganda from desperately trying to prove otherwise. Case in point, the latest season of the Russia to the Rescue series coming out on TikTok, with pretty much the same plot as always, but worse special effects. Russian propagandists are back on the scene with their favorite genre, namely thinly disguised motion picture fakery. This time they decided to prove that Ukrainians are taking to the streets en masse and calling on Moscow for help. In fact, these videos are fake news 101. They take all recordings of real protests filmed back in the 2010s and overlay them with new audio, where quote-unquote Ukrainians are supposedly shouting something about Russian help. Sometimes they don't even bother to remove old flags, banners, or winter jackets from protests that took place a long time ago. I mean, who would be going out into the streets with Ukrainian flags and asking Russia for help? Nobody. The goal is the same as always: to create the illusion that Ukrainians are tired of the war and nostalgic for the so-called Russian world. This is a classic propaganda ploy, an attempt to sow doubt that not everything is so clear-cut. If you see sensational videos on social media, check the source, the date, and most importantly, whether there is anything like RT or RIA Novosti in the captions. Because, as practice shows, everything that Russian propaganda calls help usually ends up with Grad rockets and filtration camps. And no amount of rather basic video editing is going to change that. Because the truth is simple. The only thing Ukrainians are asking Russia to do is to leave and never, ever come back. And with this, we conclude this edition of Break the Fake. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.